Well, it's been a while, and gosh, I don't think I've done a new Love at First Right since before the summer. And now it is October, and we are coming up close to Halloween, and finally I've got some time. So here I sit with wet hair, fresh out of the shower, and I'm ready to talk about what else. It's around Halloween, so we are talking about the paranormal, writing to the paranormal, about writing about ghosts and witches and demonic possession, you name it, whatever it is, because there are all sorts of stories. Really going back to Homer, of the three witches in Macbeth, for heaven's sake, that we don't really think of as paranormal stories, and yet they are, because I think that as writers, we have, obviously we are people who tend to have pretty active imaginations, and it is not unusual for us to sort of mix the spiritual and the sort of feet on the ground factual, right? Even in I think great historical fiction, there can be a little bit of a woo-woo element that just kind of gives it that extra spice, because that's really what I think the paranormal does. And I'm using that term very, very broadly. The paranormal is a spice that we add. It is another layer, another world in the world that we're building. I guess with this new series that I've launched, and Savage Island is the teaser novel for it, and it is out, and people are responding really well to it, so I'm thrilled. And it's the teaser novel for this series called Breath, which definitely has a sort of mythological and therefore paranormal element to it, right? Because it's about these reincarnated souls who are born over and over again and must find each other in each life, and are also attempting to, save humanity from itself and solve this great sort of mystery that has stretched out over, say, 6,000 years. So that is about the most paranormal I've ever gotten. I've also written several historical thrillers, but even those have ghosts in it. In one of them, one of my characters became the angel of death, at least in the mind of one of the living characters. So you never really know if he truly is the angel of death or if this other character is imagining it. And another is hesitant. Well, hesitant is too mild a word, is anguished about leaving Moscow, though he desperately wants to leave Moscow. He's very curious about the world outside of Soviet Russia, but what makes it difficult for him to leave is the ghost of his wife who sits at his breakfast table. So these paranormal elements can be... they can just add a wonderful dimension to a story. I think that all of us, I think the reason why we respond to the paranormal, even those of us who are oh so rational and think that we don't like it in fiction, tend to respond to it when it's done very well, and or when it's subtle, when it's not something that's about vampires, let's say, which is kind of a very overt supernatural element, which I actually also think is wonderful. Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula, is one of my favorite novels of all time. And it is so marvelous, it is so supernatural, and it is so subtle, and has created one of the greatest characters in history. Dracula, who barely walks on in this novel. He's on it for, if it were a 2-hour movie, for a total of 12 minutes. He's actually on the scene. You actually get to watch the characters interact with him. And yet he hovers, spoken and unspoken, throughout the entire novel. He is such a heavy presence, and that's just the touch of an incredible master to be able to create something like that. But as I said, we all have an element of the spiritual in our lives, something that, even if it's simply intuition, even the most rational of us will acknowledge a gut feeling or an intuition. for me, I tend to be a little more on the rational side, though I'm certainly, a very spiritual person. I consider myself a Catholic. And so, I do have a sort of religious core to me, even though that has kind of come and gone throughout my life. And one of the things that I found amazing about when we moved into our very old home, we live in a 200-year-old house that has gone through so many iterations. I mean, it's been everything from a general store to, our basement was a Civil War morgue. It's been a musician's flop house in the 60s. It just has this tremendous history. And particularly when we first moved in, before we sort of filled out the space, we felt a presence. I mean, I don't even know how to describe that. There were only a handful of times when anything actually really went bump in the night, and yet this sort of sense of the spiritual in our house was as palpable as sexual attraction. It was most of the time nothing that I could really put my finger on to prove to someone. I mean, really, the only time that I can actually say we had a kind of a real odd occurrence that I could explain to, say, someone who doesn't believe in ghosts at all, right? Is my husband and I were sleeping, and I got up to get a drink of water, and when I came back, I very distinctly heard a man's whisper, and it was as close as if it was 3 inches from my ear. And I said to my husband, I was like, honey, did you say something? And my husband said, no, but I heard it too. Let's just talk about this in the morning. And we did talk about it in the morning, but truth be told, I have not had very many actual ghostly experiences like that. And yet I do feel a sort of excitement and instinctual sort of feeling about the presence of an energy, let's say, of another world. In my as the sort of quote to Savage Island, which is the first in the series that I was telling you about. I quote Socrates in the beginning, and I'm going to butcher this quote because I don't know it word for word, but he essentially said that he believes that the spirits of the dead coexist with the living. And of course, I don't know if he meant that literally or figuratively, but it really hardly matters, because I think that is what inspires a writer to write the paranormal and a reader to read the paranormal. We are looking to satisfy that itch, that small niggling feeling, that the hair raising at the back of your neck, that we have all felt at one time or another and either dismissed or embraced. And as we write paranormal stories, or even as we write the most subtle paranormal element into our stories, like I said, the gut feeling is probably the most subtle, and I'm sure most people don't think of that as paranormal, but it is. Is it tangible? No, it's only tangible to the person feeling it. You can try to explain your gut feeling to another person, and they will nod along and say, well, that's very interesting. But they can't possibly answer your gut feeling. The only thing they can perhaps say is, well, you got to go with your gut, which is, something that all of us have heard at one time or another and probably believe to a certain extent. And so as we tread into this territory as writers, as we decide whether we're going to full on embrace the paranormal and say, write about witches and wizards, and vampires and ghosts and monsters and demonic possession, whatever it is that is delicious to us, or as we endeavor to perhaps simply add another dimension, spice up our stories by giving our protagonist, say, an unusual gift, like in the series Homeland, which is television and not literature, obviously, but God, it's such a great show. Carrie, who is the main character, and she is a spy. Her paranormal gift is that she is bipolar, And when she goes off her meds, she can draw brilliant conclusions. I mean, truly, and solve these sort of espionage related crimes, I guess, in a way that the people around her cannot, and in a way that she can't when she's on her medication. So I guess when I am endeavoring to add the paranormal into my story, and with me, I'm with this new series, I can be less careful because the people who would be interested in reading those stories are already paranormal friendly. But for instance, when I was writing my historical thrillers and I knew that I was adding just a touch of a paranormal element to them, I tried to be very, very careful about how I introduced it, and that there was, I suppose, some deniability for instance, the character to maybe be imagining it to some extent, even though it's a very credible character, because I was very well aware that classical thriller readers tend to fall on the more rational side and tend to feel like a story has gone off the rails if you go a little bit too deeply into the paranormal. And whereas if you are writing for a paranormal reader and you are too coy about it and you don't come right out and say, this person's a witch or whatever it is, they will feel like you haven't satisfied them. They're going to say to themselves, wait a minute, this was sold to me as a paranormal romance or as a fantasy, and where is that element? It's very vague. It's mushy. I want to know who these people are. I want to know that they really are reincarnated, that this is not part of their imagination. This is real, and I want that validated. I want to know that this person is a vampire. They drink blood, they will live forever, and they can't go out in the daylight, damn it. And so it's very, very important for us as writers, as we are delving into this, and as our imaginations can maybe sometimes get the better of us, and we might start writing in a sort of genre-bending way or in a way that is entirely outside of our genre, all of which is fine, as long as you are very, very conscious of what you're doing and of who your readers are. And they're out there. I mean, if you write it, there are people who are probably interested in what you have to say, but then it's a matter of finding them, and that's not always easy. It's very easy, for instance, if you're a writer and you are writing a thriller and you want to, target readers of James Patterson because he is just, such a huge thriller writer. Well, that's very easy. But then if you're writing some sort of woo-woo quasi-literary historical thriller and you're targeting James Patterson and people are expecting James Patterson and they pick up your book, they are going to be mightily disappointed. So I guess that's what I'm working through in my mind this week. What kind of, if you are a paranormal writer, what kind of paranormal writer are you? And if you are not, if you are wholly rational, how can you, in a way that is acceptable to you as a fiercely rational being, and in a way that is acceptable to your readers, how can you pump up that interesting element, that superpower of being bipolar and going off your meds, right? Of that sort of paranormal element. How can you make your story more interesting using the paranormal and yet grounding it in reality, fiercely grounding it in reality? So anyway, happy Halloween. It's been great saying this out loud, talking about it, understanding where I'm headed and why, especially as I start the second big book of this series, because the first one is finished, but I'm just waiting on publication in a few months, and I'm starting the second book in this series, which takes place largely in Egypt, in Cairo in 1902, and also in part in Alaska, present day. So it's so something to sink my teeth into, and getting that that element, that mix of the rational and the historical and the paranormal is paramount. Thanks. Have a great one.